They had no murder weapon. They had no crime scene. They had no witnesses.
A woman disappears. No body. No witnesses. Just a wood chipper, a suspicious husband, and tiny fragments of evidence that would expose a murder. How do you convict someone without a body? This is the Hellecraft case. Police did not treat it as murder at first. Richard Crafts told them his wife had left him. He said she flew back to Denmark after an argument. He claimed she packed a bag and walked out. Detectives checked. There was no airline ticket in her name, no record of a flight. Her passport had not been used. Her bank account had not been touched. She had not contacted her family in Denmark. That was unusual. Helle called them often. The story started to fall apart. Then neighbors began talking. One neighbor reported hearing a loud machine running late at night during a heavy snowstorm. It was past midnight. The sound went on for hours. When the neighbor looked outside, he saw Richard near his driveway operating equipment. Another neighbor remembered something else. Just days before Helle vanished, Richard had rented a large commercial freezer. Around the same time, he had purchased a new wood chipper. The rental and the purchase were unusual. There were no trees being cleared on the property. Detectives dug deeper. They searched the house. In the master bedroom, they found bloodstains on the carpet near the bed. The mattress was gone. A section of carpet had been cut out and removed. In the garage, they found more blood. It was on tools and on the floor. The pattern suggested cleanup. The area had been washed. Forensic tests confirmed the blood belonged to Helle. Investigators checked Richard's credit card records. The wood chipper rental was charged just before her disappearance. The rental period covered the night of the snowstorm. Then they looked outside. Fresh snowfall had covered the ground the night Helle vanished. Tire tracks were preserved in the snow. Investigators traced the path away from the house. The tracks led toward a bridge over the Housatonic River. Under that bridge, the snow had been disturbed. At this point, the case was no longer a missing person file. It was a crime scene without a body. The snow beneath it showed signs of disturbance. Ice along the riverbank had been broken. It looked recent. Search teams were called in. At first, officers searched by hand. They combed the riverbank for anything unusual. Nothing obvious appeared. If a body had been placed there, it was no longer intact. Divers entered the water. The current was strong. Visibility was low. The riverbed was covered in mud and debris. Then, something small was found. A fragment of bone. Search crews widened the area. More pieces surfaced. Tissue, hair, small fragments scattered across the riverbed. The remains were not whole, they were shredded. Forensic specialists examined what was recovered. They confirmed the fragments were human. Dental experts identified several teeth as belonging to Helle. The match was conclusive. The river told a clear story, but investigators still needed to understand how the remains ended up there. That is when the wood chipper became central. Engineers examined the machine Richard had rented. They studied the blade pattern and cutting mechanics. The damage to the bone fragments matched the type of shredding produced by that model. The theory became direct and brutal. Helle had been killed inside the house. Her body had been frozen. Then it had been fed into the wood chipper during the snowstorm. The remains were dumped into the river under cover of weather and darkness. But even with bone fragments and blood evidence, prosecutors faced a problem. There was no complete body. And in the late 1980s, that mattered. Investigators now understood they were not searching for a victim. They were searching for fragments. The search zone expanded along the Housatonic River. Snow was melting. Ice was breaking apart. If remains had been dumped during the storm, they could have spread downstream. Law enforcement brought in canine search teams trained in human remains detection. Handlers guided the dogs along the riverbanks, through brush and thawing snow. When a dog alerted, The location was marked. Search crews returned to those spots and sifted carefully through mud and debris. More bone fragments were recovered, small pieces, scattered over distance. The pattern became clear. The remains had been mechanically destroyed and dispersed. By the end of the recovery effort, dozens of fragments were collected. Dental records confirmed the identity. The remains belonged to Hellecrafts. Now prosecutors faced a rare problem. They could prove destruction. They could prove identity, but they still did not have a body. Prosecutors faced an unprecedented challenge, convicting a man without a corpse. They relied on physical evidence from the Crafts' home. Bloodstains on the bedroom carpet and garage tools proved a violent event had occurred. The missing mattress suggested an attempt to hide or move a body. Fragments recovered from the river, though incomplete, were sufficient to identify Hella through dental records. Each tiny piece told a story of destruction. The woodchipper became central. Engineers examined its blades. The pattern of shredding on bone fragments matched the mechanics of that model. Forensic scientists reconstructed the likely sequence. The body had been frozen, then fed into the woodchipper during the snowstorm. The remains were dumped into the river under cover of weather and darkness. But even with bone fragments and blood evidence, prosecutors faced a problem. There was no complete body, and in the late 1980s, that mattered. Investigators now understood they were not searching for a victim. They were searching for fragments. The search zone expanded along the Housatonic River. Snow was melting. Ice was breaking apart. If remains had been dumped during the storm, they could have spread downstream. Law enforcement brought in canine search teams trained in human remains detection. Handlers guided the dogs along the riverbanks, through brush and thawing snow. When a dog alerted, the location was marked. Search crews returned to those spots and sifted carefully through mud and debris. More bone fragments were recovered, small pieces, scattered over distance. The pattern became clear. The remains had been mechanically destroyed and dispersed. By the end of the recovery effort, dozens of fragments were collected. Dental records confirmed the identity. The remains belonged to Hellecrafts. Now prosecutors faced a rare problem. They could prove destruction. They could prove identity, but they still did not have a body. Prosecutors faced an unprecedented challenge, convicting a man without a corpse. They relied on physical evidence from the Crafts' home. Bloodstains on the bedroom carpet and garage tools proved a violent event had occurred. The missing mattress suggested an attempt to hide or move a body. Fragments recovered from the river, though incomplete, were sufficient to identify Hella through dental records. Each tiny piece told a story of destruction. The woodchipper became central. Engineers examined its blades. The pattern of shredding on bone fragments matched the mechanics of that model. Forensic scientists reconstructed the likely sequence. The body had been frozen, then fed into the woodchipper during the snowstorm. The remains were dumped into the river under cover of weather and darkness. But even with bone fragments and blood evidence, prosecutors faced a problem. There was no complete body, and in the late 1980s, that mattered. Investigators also documented Richard's behavior. He had rented a large freezer, purchased a woodchipper, and operated machinery late at night during a snowstorm. Neighbors had noticed unusual activity, and credit card records confirmed these purchases aligned with the timeline of Hella's disappearance. Every action built motive and intent. The prosecution organized the evidence into a chain. Blood evidence, fragment analysis, dental identification, and Richard's suspicious purchases created a complete narrative. Hellecrafts had been killed in her home, her body destroyed, and the remains disposed of. Each piece of evidence supported the next. Together, they made the case for murder, even without a body. Experts testified on fragment analysis, showing how mechanical destruction of the remains matched the mechanics of that machine. They explained how even small tissue fragments could indicate the use of specific equipment. The jury was led step by step through the reconstruction of the crime, the timing, the method, and the disposal. Richard Crafts had no alternative explanation. His story, that Hella simply left, collapsed under the weight of coordinated forensic and circumstantial evidence. The prosecution didn't need a full body. They built the crime scene in court from fragments, patterns, and behavior. As investigators pieced together the evidence, Richard Crafts' behavior drew increasing scrutiny. He maintained his story. Hella simply left, gone back to Denmark after an argument. But inconsistencies piled up. He had told neighbors and police that she had left quietly, yet he had not contacted her family. He claimed she flew out, but there were no airline tickets, no passport usage, no luggage. Each denial undermined his credibility. During the search of the house, Richard appeared calm, almost meticulous. He had removed the mattress, cleaned carpet stands, and rented a freezer. Small details, the timing of the woodchipper rental, the placement of tools, the late-night activity, all became pieces of a pattern. Investigators noted how he had attempted to control the scene, erase evidence, and project normalcy. Neighbors recalled seeing him operate machinery late at night during the snowstorm. The sound carried across the quiet streets, but Richard offered no explanation beyond vague claims of yard work. These actions, mundane in isolation, became significant when combined with the blood evidence, missing mattress, and fragment recovery. Psychologists consulted by the prosecution described Crafts as controlled and deliberate. He planned movements carefully, calculated how to obscure traces of his wife, and tried to manipulate perception. He displayed no outward panic, no admission, just a series of calculated actions that investigators could document and use to reconstruct the crime timeline. Even as the river search and fragment recovery expanded, he maintained his story. Yet his meticulousness, cleaning, shredding, hiding, was a window into intent. Every purchase, every movement, every step became evidence of premeditation. By the time fragments were analyzed and forensic reports were ready, Richard Crafts was no longer just a husband telling a story. To investigators and later to the jury, he was a man whose actions had created a trail, a map of guilt, without ever leaving a complete body behind. The trial began in 1989. The courtroom was tense. Richard Crafts sat quietly, expression neutral, as the prosecution outlined their unprecedented case. They opened by explaining the disappearance. Hellecraft vanished on November 18, 1986. No ticket, no passport activity, no contact with family. They emphasized that Richard's story of her leaving voluntarily did not match the evidence. Prosecutors presented the home evidence first: bloodstains on the bedroom carpet, blood on garage tools, the missing mattress. They walked the jury through the sequence of discovery, showing how investigators had reconstructed the events inside the house. Each stain, each fragment, each detail formed part of the narrative of violence. Then came the river fragments. Forensic specialists testified about each bone and tissue sample recovered from the Housatonic River. Dental records confirmed the identity: Hellecraft's. Engineers explained how the fragments had been mechanically destroyed. The woodchipper's blade pattern matched the damage on the bones. The jury saw diagrams and photographs of the evidence. Prosecutors emphasized the timeline of Richard's actions: late-night woodchipper operation during a snowstorm, the freezer rental, the purchases, neighborhood observations. Each act demonstrated planning and intent. They argued that the careful removal, destruction, and dispersal of remains showed premeditation. The canine search teams were introduced as part of the investigation. Handlers explained how the dogs had identified additional fragment locations along the riverbanks, confirming the dispersal and destruction of the remains. Even without a complete body, these alerts helped reconstruct the disposal sequence. Throughout opening arguments, the prosecution made one point clear: the lack of a full corpse did not mean a lack of evidence. Every fragment, stain, and action created a trail of guilt. They told a story the jury could follow from disappearance to destruction, step by step, with forensic certainty. After weeks of testimony, the case moved to the jury. They had heard from forensic experts, engineers, investigators, and canine handlers. They had seen photographs of bloodstains, fragmented remains, and the woodchipper. They had followed the timeline of Richard's actions, from late-night machinery use to suspicious purchases and attempts to hide evidence. The jury deliberated. There was no body, no complete corpse, yet the evidence was overwhelming. Each fragment, each stain, each calculated act told the same story. Hellecraft had been killed, and Richard Crafts had destroyed her body to cover the crime. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder. Richard Crafts was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The case made history. It was the first bodiless murder conviction in the United States. The ruling demonstrated that murder could be proven without a corpse when forensic evidence, circumstantial evidence, and investigative reconstruction were compelling enough. The case set a precedent. Law enforcement and prosecutors could now pursue similar cases with confidence. Cadaver dogs, fragment analysis, and meticulous documentation became standard tools for complex investigations. The Hellecraft's case showed that even in the absence of a full body, justice could be achieved when evidence was carefully collected, analyzed, and presented. The fragments told the story. The blood told the story. But it was the canine units that helped investigators see the pattern hidden in the snow, brush, and riverbanks. Without their noses, some pieces might be lost forever. Even decades later, the images of those dogs working the frozen river remain iconic. Silent detectives following a scent only they could track. Each alert, each careful pause, each paw on the earth helped map the crime that no human eyes could fully reconstruct. Richard Crafts went to prison. Hellecraft's body was never whole again, but the dogs had ensured that the truth could not be buried. And somewhere in forests, rivers, and snowy fields, trained noses are still at work, hunting what humans cannot see, following trails that refuse to stay hidden. Because in cases like this, it's not just evidence. It's the dogs that never forget, never rest, and never let a killer's trail go cold.